During the pandemic, many large employers have tracked their employees' movements. Now, a new legislation could change that. Plus, what are your rights if you choose not to return to the office as we come out of this pandemic? Here to break it down for us is Alex Lucifero, partner at Samfiru Tumarkin LLP. Alex, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with that legislation. Break it down for us, and if it passes, how it would impact workers?
Sure. Well, it's a timely one, Annette, in that privacy, and as you very well mentioned, over the past couple of years since the start of the pandemic, privacy has become more of an issue in the workplace. How is your employer tracking you, let's say, for employees working from home? What is being tracked? And there's a blurring of the lines, of course, between your personal time and your work time, and that's brought that issue to the forefront. Now, it needs to be said, Annette, we haven't seen this legislation yet. The devil will be in the details, of course. And so I'm wondering here how far our provincial government will actually go in protecting employees' privacy rights. I'm worried they'll stop short of, making any real movement in that direction. For example, the right to disconnect legislation that we saw a couple of months ago simply asked employers to have a policy with respect to the right for employees to disconnect. I'm concerned that with respect to privacy rights, the government will do the same thing.
I think that the minute you say tracking employees' work, it automatically would get someone's backup. But could there be good in doing that?
Well, listen, I think it's expected that in an employment relationship, there has to be a degree of supervision, of oversight when it comes to what employees are doing or potentially not doing. And of course, when you're in the office, when you're walking the halls, when you're going in and out of offices, or even in a manufacturer, for example, I think there's an implicit supervision there. It of course becomes harder for people working from home. So I think employers do have a point there to make, which is they want to make sure that employees are staying productive. There has to be a line drawn in the sand. For example, employers shouldn't be tracking personal devices, personal computers, personal cell phones, etc. It has to be strictly about the work, and it has to be as minimally invasive as possible.
Let's talk about that return to work. We still are waiting on what will happen with the largest employer in this town, that is the Federal Public Service. What does that look like for people who say, no, I'm actually more productive at home, I'd like to work from home? Do they have a leg to stand on there and say that to their employer?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it certainly warrants a conversation between an employee and an employer. I think for most employees, Annette, if working from home was a temporary measure and an employer made clear to that employee, to those employees, that it was indeed a temporary measure, those employers do have the right to call employees back into the office. I don't think there's anything really an employee can do, again, as long as it was made clear to them that this was a temporary measure. An employee that's been working from home, even prior to COVID, let's say, or where it's become a permanent term of employment, or even in a situation where, for example, a hybrid model of, let's say, working from home part of the week and working in the office the other part, if those are permanent terms of employment, then certainly an employee is well within their rights to say, no, I'd like to keep these terms of employment and not return to the office.
Is this going to have to be pretty black and white moving forward for any employer, and legislation may be the way to do that, to make sure it's very clear what is expected of employees, whether or not they can work from home or not moving forward?
Certainly, the more clarity, the better. Unfortunately, employment relationships are sticky like any other relationships, and so it is case by case. It is going to be context specific, and so depending on your individual circumstances, depending on what type of employment, whether you're unionized, whether you're non-unionized, I think the circumstances and the legalities around the situation will change.
Are we going to see a completely different type of workforce as we come out of the pandemic?
I think there'll be changes for sure. An entirely different type of workplace is probably a bit of an overstatement. I think in most industries, our employment laws haven't really changed, and that's a good thing. And I mean, employment laws are quite protective of employees, at least in the province of Ontario and across Canada. And again, that hasn't changed. Perhaps with some privacy legislation, things will become more robust for employees, and that's certainly not a bad thing.
All right, Alex, always great to chat with you, get your insight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.